Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is really to pull out the essential insights from a single, pretty complex piece of research for you. We want to give you that shortcut to understanding what makes one of the world's most productive marine areas tick, or sometimes we'll completely shift gears. We're talking about the Humboldt Current System.
Yeah, exactly. And the paper we're diving into today is it's a really key one from 2007 by Luis Cubillos and his colleagues. The title kind of lays it all out. Synchronous pattern of fluctuation in 3 anchovy fisheries in the Humboldt Current System. It's basically taking, 4 decades of fishing data and trying to see the climate signals hidden within.
That's right. We're looking at the ups and downs of the South American anchovy and Grallis ringens and the star here all along the coasts of Peru and Chile. And this deep dive specifically covers the years 1960 right through to 2002. It's a look at an ecosystem that's just so incredibly productive, it literally shapes the economies there.
hmm And the core question they tackled is, well, it's fundamental, really, for managing fisheries anywhere, but especially here. You've got these 3 anchovy stocks, pretty separate geographically over thousands of kilometers. Are they all reacting to the big environmental drivers in the Pacific, like El Nino in the same way at the same time, synchronously? And doesn't matter if you look long-term, like decades versus short-term, year to year. So are we seeing these slow, big interdecadal shifts or more of the faster interannual jumps? Understanding that synchronicity is just crucial if you want to anticipate those massive regime shifts that can flip the whole system.
Okay, let's break down the geography first, because I think where these fisheries are located becomes really important later on, right? The paper looks at 3 distinct anchovy fishing zones. First, there's A, north central Peru. That's the giant, the most productive zone by a long shot.
Yeah, the tower house.
Then there's B, the fishery shared between southern Peru and northern Chile, kind of the connector zone.
Right, acts as a bridge.
And third, C, the central south Chile fishery. That's the one further south, most austral, they call it. And it's a smaller stock, less abundant.
And, while scientists still debate a bit whether they're truly separate stocks or maybe more connected, the shared experience for fishermen and managers is these huge, sometimes devastating fluctuations. The whole system has this history of flipping between times when anchovy is everywhere and then periods where sardines, sardinops, sagacs suddenly take over.
The competitor.
Exactly. So the goal here was to take that sort of anecdotal knowledge, those stories of boom and bust, and apply some statistical rigor. They wanted to separate out the slow underlying changes from the fast, maybe more random annual noise. People suspected synchrony, but this paper was really the first to statistically test it across all 3 areas like this.
Got it. And you mentioned data earlier. What were the constraints they were working with?
Right. Well, they used annual catch data, just the total tonnage caught each year, from 1960 to 2002. They deliberately started in 1960 to avoid the early years, the 1950s, when the industrial fisheries were just starting up. Back then, low catches might just mean nobody was fishing much yet, not that there weren't many fish.
Okay. So it avoids that initial ramp-up confusion.
Precisely. And they had to rely on catch data because getting consistent, long-term scientific surveys of actual fish abundance across all 3 regions for that entire 42-year period, it just wasn't feasible. Those data sets didn't exist in a uniform way.
Okay, so using catch means you need some clever statistics to figure out what's the environment doing versus maybe just changes in fishing itself. How do they approach that?
They used a statistical technique called a Loess smoother. You can think of it maybe like a digital sanding block. It takes the raw, jagged line of the annual catches and gently smooths it out, revealing the underlying longer-term trend by reducing the year-to-year bumps.
So the smoother basically helps them split the data into 2 different kinds of patterns.
Exactly. It gives you 2 layers of variability. First, you get the long-term slow-moving pattern. That's the interdecadal variation. It's the smooth curve left after you've kind of averaged out the yearly spikes and dips. This represents those big multi-year shifts, the potential regime shifts.
Okay, the big wave and the second part.
That's the interannual variation. These are the leftovers, essentially. The differences between the actual catch each year and that smooth trend line. This captures the higher frequency, year-to-year ups and downs. And this is the component they then tried to link to environmental factors, specifically the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO.
Right, the ENSO connection. And they didn't just look at ENSO generally, did they? They were quite specific.
Very specific. They looked at sea surface temperature anomalies, SSTs, in a particular part of the Pacific, the El Nino 1+2 region. That's the patch of ocean right off Peru and Ecuador that's super sensitive to El Nino warming. And crucially, they didn't look at the SST during the fishing year, but during the austral spring, September to December of the previous year.
Why the previous year's spring?
That's key to the biology. Anchovies are short-lived fish. They typically enter the fishery when they're about a year old. So the number of fish available to be caught in any given year is heavily influenced by how successful the spawning and survival of the young fish the recruits was the year before. That spring period is critical for the early life stages. So, by linking warm water, then a positive SST anomaly to potentially lower catches the following year, they were directly testing El Niño's impact on the survival of those young fish before they even became catchable.
Okay, makes sense. So let's get to the findings. What did they discover about the long-term, the interdecadal changes? Did those three fisheries sync up over the decades?
Remarkably so. The pattern was strikingly consistent across all three, thousands of kilometers apart. They all showed a similar history, high catches roughly from 1960 to 1972, then a big crash and low catches from about 1973 to 1984. Then catches started increasing again from the mid-80s up to the mid-90s. Now, the sheer volume was different. North central Peru had the biggest swings, obviously, but the timing, the ups and downs, was broadly shared.
And statistically,
Yeah.
was this visual pattern backed up?
Absolutely. That's the main result for the long-term view. The interdecadal variations were highly coherent. That's the statistical term for being very similar across all three anchovy fisheries. The smooth lowages trend explained a really significant chunk of the total variation in catches. The R-squared values were between 0.51 and 0.76, which is substantial. It confirmed these weren't just random fluctuations. Significant shared long-term changes were definitely happening across the board.
So what does that level of synchrony imply?
It strongly suggests a common forcing mechanism. Something big, operating on a large scale, is pushing all three stocks in the same direction over these longer timescales. We're likely not talking about localized weather patterns. This points towards those larger basin-scale climate shifts in the Pacific, maybe linked to things researchers sometimes refer to with terms like El Viejo and La Vieja, these decadal warm and cool phases.
Right, so if El Niño is like the annual storm warning, El Viejo is more like the long, slow change in the climate tide itself, affecting the whole basin for a decade or more.
That's a good analogy. And interestingly, the synchronous anchovy pattern they found, it was also shown to be out of phase with what was happening with sardines. Remember that anchovy slump period in the mid-70s and 80s?
Yeah.
That's exactly when sardine populations boomed and catches increased dramatically in the Humboldt. So the synchrony in anchovy decline matched the synchrony in sardine increase. It really supports the idea of these basin-wide ecosystem flips or regime shifts.
Wow, okay. That's a major finding on the decadal scale. But what about the short term? The year-to-year noise, the interannual variability, did the synchrony hold up there? Did El Niño drive things consistently?
This is where the picture gets more complex, more regional. On the interannual timescale, the synchrony broke down. The year-to-year fluctuations were only synchronous between the two northern fisheries, that's north-central Peru, and the shared South Peru-northern Chile zone.
Okay, so the two neighbors tracked each other year to year, which maybe isn't totally surprising given they're closer.
Right.
And what about their link to ESO? Did El Niño affect them?
Yes, for those two northern fisheries, they found a significant relationship. Specifically, a negative relationship between the interannual catch variability and the ENSO index, the SST anomalies from the previous spring. So basically, warmer El Niño conditions in the spring tended to lead to lower anchovy recruitment and therefore lower catches the next year in those northern areas.
Which confirms the general understanding of El Niño being bad for the anchovy fishery in Peru, right?
It does. It provides statistical backing for that well-known negative impact, especially in the northern part of the system. But here's the twist.
There's always a twist.
The central South Chile fishery, the one furthest south, its interannual ups and downs showed no significant statistical relationship with ENSO variability whatsoever.
Really? So El Niño's signal just disappears further south?
Statistically speaking, yes, in this analysis. It could be because the physical effects of El Niño, the warming, the changes in currents and nutrients, are known to be strongest near the equator and weaken as you move south along the Chilean coast. Or it could also support a broader ecological idea. Populations living at the very edge of a species' geographical range often respond differently or less strongly to environmental pressures compared to populations in the core range.
That's fascinating. But let's add a layer of caution back onto the ENSO finding for the north. You said the relationship was significant, but how strong was it?
That's a really important point the authors made. They described the correlation for those two northern fisheries as rather weak overall. It only became statistically significant, really, because of the huge impact of three specific massive El Nino events during the study period they mentioned, years like 83 and 98. These extreme events had such a strong negative effect that they essentially pulled the average relationship down. They called it a leverage effect.
A leverage effect, meaning a few extreme data points are disproportionately influencing the overall trend line.
Exactly. It suggests that while those monster El Niños are undeniably catastrophic for the fishery and have to be accounted for, the run-of-the-mill average El Niño or La Niña year might not be the main thing consistently driving the year-to-year catch variability in a predictable way.
Okay, and that observation leads directly into the management implications, doesn't it?
It really does. If that year-to-year ENSO link is actually quite weak or mostly driven by a few huge outliers, it implies that focusing solely on predicting the next El Nino might be less critical for long-term thinking than understanding those big, slow-moving interdecadal shifts, the regime shifts.
Because those affect the entire system simultaneously.
Right. They affect all three fisheries, and the changes in productivity seem much more dramatic and sustained during those regime shifts. And there's other ecological evidence that backs this up. The paper mentions, for instance, that studies found zooplankton levels, the anchovies' food, were actually higher during the cold anchovy-dominated decades, like the 1960s.
And didn't you mention the sardine competition angle earlier?
Yes, the idea that sardines might do better when the food web changes may be favoring smaller plankton during warmer sardine-friendly regimes, while anchovies prefer larger stuff more typical of colder anchovy regimes. It all supports the picture of these being fundamental reorganizations of the entire ecosystem, not just one species going up or down independently.
Okay, but we should touch on the limitations too. What caveats did the authors themselves raise?
Well, the big one is the reliance on catch data we discussed earlier. While the catch patterns generally match what we know from later abundance estimates, you can't entirely rule out the influence of fishing effort. Could synchronous changes in fishing pressure, especially during the big industrial expansion in the 60s, have contributed to the synchronous catch patterns independent of climate? It's hard to completely disentangle.
Right, the classic fisheries problem.
Yeah.
Separating the signal of the fish from the signal of the fisher.
Exactly. And the other major point is about the time series length. Even though 42 years sounds like a lot, when you're talking about proving links to decadal or multi-decadal climate cycles, it's still considered relatively short. You ideally need much longer data sets to be absolutely certain that these long-term shifts are purely climate-driven and not influenced by other factors, including fishing over the long haul.
So wrapping that up, the key insight seems to be this separation of scales.
Yeah. The interannual stuff, the yearly jumps possibly linked to ENSO, that seems to be more of a regional phenomenon, mainly affecting the north. But the interdecadal swings, the big regime shifts potentially linked to longer-term climate patterns like Alveola Vieja, those appear to be basin scale, hitting the whole Humboldt Current System at once.
So the final thought for you, the listener, what's the big takeaway here?
I think the most critical point is this. Even if we got incredibly good at predicting next year's anchovy numbers based on ENSO forecasts, the really massive challenge for managing these fisheries sustainably over the long run comes from those slower, larger, decadal scale shifts. The potential for the whole system to flip from anchovy dominance to sardine dominance, or back again. That's the bigger wave that managers need to navigate, and it's much harder to predict than the annual storm.
Which leaves us with a pretty challenging question to think about. If our data records, even spanning decades, are still potentially too short to definitively prove the link between these huge ecosystem shifts and long-term climate cycles, how much confidence can we really place in management strategies designed to last for decades, especially knowing that human factors, like fishing pressure itself, are also part of that complex historical equation?
It's the fundamental puzzle, isn't it? Working at that intersection of climate, ocean ecosystems, and human activity.
A really fascinating deep dive. Hopefully this gives you a much clearer picture of the complex, shifting dynamics within the incredibly important Humboldt Current System.